And so Seventh-day Adventist, in a sense, doesn't reference Revelation, but actually it does. This is the everlasting gospel. God created everything. There is a purpose to existence. And though there is evil, which arises from men and women's free choice and free will, God will destroy that evil and put an end to it. And so there's if you like, a nice circle there, the true circle of life. God is the creator. He created us. He gave us free will. We mess things up pretty spectacularly. But God, through Jesus Christ, has a solution to that problem, and there will be an end, and there will be perfection thereafter.
Have you ever wondered why there are so many Christian denominations in the world? While we don't directly answer that question, my guest in today's episode, Dr. David Trim, and I do discuss denominational relevancy in the 21st century, particularly as it relates to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, of which I am a part of. I was particularly interested in discussing the history and meaning of the name Seventh-day Adventist because we live in a day and age where Christianity is becoming almost completely generic. Now, some might argue that is a good thing, but I wondered if perhaps going back to our past might remind us of the unique mission God has given our church to share with the world in these last days. Now, for those of you who don't know, David Trim is a historian, archivist, and educator whose specialties are in European military history and religious history. Currently, he is the director of the Archives, Statistics, and Research at the world headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I hope you are enriched by my conversation with him as much as I was. Now, while David considers himself culturally British, he was born in India, grew up in Australia, and currently works in the United States. I started our conversation by asking him how his multicultural background helped shape his views of the world and the church.
That's also a very good question, and inevitably it does. One of the things that one learns is that the church is not the same everywhere, and it helps one to distinguish between what is central in Adventism and what is arguably peripheral. And much of what we get agitated about, worked up about, isn't really central. But there are things that are important and cannot be compromised on. But there are many things that really are cultural, and the things that we, in one country, will identify as being, for want of better terms, conservative or liberal or radical. Some of those attitudes or practices in another country will belong to the other group entirely, and that makes one realize how arbitrary these distinctions are. I think Adventists are all sometimes too quick to label others as being of a certain camp, and labeling is never good, but that kind of exposure to other cultures makes one realize that it's often very facile, and it's certainly not particularly helpful. So just understanding that there's lots of different ways of doing things, that there's different ways of doing things right. There's not just one right way of doing things. There are several ways of doing things that could be effective or efficacious.
Also, I noticed when you were in England particularly, you studied and you worked on a PhD in European military history. And I was just curious, before we kind of get into the main topic of our discussion today, what drew you into that particular area of study?
I was always interested in military history, which is perhaps a little strange for someone born and raised in a church that, at least traditionally, disapproved of military service. But that was just the way I was. So I was always been interested in military history, but I was also interested in the history of the Reformation. So my PhD was on the period of religious wars that came after the Reformation. So that was a nice way of marrying the two interests that I'd had actually since I was a boy, of the period after the Reformation and the division of what once had been a united Christendom into different camps, first Protestant and Catholic, and then Protestants divided as well, along with the military history. So that subject brought those different interests together.
And now that you're here in the United States, just tell our listeners a little bit about what you do now, and what project are you working on now that particularly excites you?
So I am Director of Archive Statistics and Research for the General Conference of Seventhday Adventist, which is the overarching organization that binds all the other levels of church structure together and provides resources for them all around the world. So I work at the world headquarters of the Seventhday Adventist Church, which is a privilege and sometimes a burden, and often very exciting. So archive statistics research, we maintain the archives and records management program of the world headquarters. We also collect information and publish it. We collect statistics and publish an annual statistical report. And we also publish the Seventh-day Adventist Yearbook, which lists every organization in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which has a very complex structure. So there are many organizations, right down to the level of a local conference, or in some parts of the world it's called a mission. Something, for those of your listeners who are familiar with the Catholic or Anglican tradition, something like a diocese, a union, which is something like an archdiocese, and then what we call our world division, which is, as it were, a branch office of the General Conference in different parts of the world, one or two per continent. So collecting all that information and then also publishing about the institutions. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has the world's second largest parochial school system after the Roman Catholic. We have around 120 universities and thousands of secondary schools and elementary schools, tens of thousands of elementary schools. And we don't actually publish all of those because there's too many, but the secondary schools and the colleges, universities we collect, and hospitals. We have hundreds of hospitals around the world, also one of the world's largest religious healthcare systems. So all that gets collected and maintained so that we're aware of it at the world headquarters, but then we publish most of it in the Seventh-day Adventist Yearbook and make it available through a website and through an app so that anyone can have access to all that information. And then the research. We do historical research using the archives. We do research using the resources of the yearbook and statistics, but we also do survey-based research. So, for example, just last year we finished a survey in every part of the world, and there were more than 64,000 church members took a questionnaire. So that's an incredible data set and represents the world, literally the world in that data, because it's Adventists from every region. So that's what we do. At present, I'm involved with refining the World Church's strategic plan. It's based on that survey that I mentioned of the 64,000 church members. It's also based on analysis we did, research we did of major trends, what strategic planners and futurists in big companies and government call mega trends, the things that will shape the world in the next 10 years, or what people think at least will shape it. But they're not always right, of course. So we drafted the World Church's strategic plan last year, and we're working to refine that so it can be approved later this year, and that will be the World Church's strategic focus for 2020 to 2025. So that's one of my biggest projects.
That's exciting. I'm actually looking forward to attending the 2020 General Conference in Indianapolis, and looking forward to bringing Adventology to that conference as well. So I imagine that will be when this is kind of presented to the public.
Correct. It will be approved by what's called Annual Council, which is a gathering of World Church leaders that takes place every autumn, or fall, as you say here in the United States. So it will be approved in October, or we hope so, but then it will be launched and publicized. There will be a big release program, a lot of material, so that we would like every Adventist church member to know what the World Church's strategic plan is, what its strategic focus is, the goals, the objectives, because we can't achieve any of them without church members. We need church members to become involved.
Well, that's a good point to transition. For someone who maybe is listening to this and doesn't know anything about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, what would you say is the central belief driving the purpose for the church's existence, in your opinion?
Well, I think it can be summarized in a text from the book of Revelation. In the Bible, Revelation 14 talks about an angel flying in the heavens, and he has a message, and that message is to proclaim the everlasting gospel. And that really, Adventists have identified with that since the 1850s, before the church was really even formally established, and has stayed with us, and I really think it captures it. Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 says that there's an angel flying in the midst of heaven who has the everlasting gospel to proclaim to all who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, every nation, every language, every ethnicity. And the message is, fear God, and this is verse 7, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who has made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water. So that is what Seventh-day Adventists have always been about, and I think still are about, is proclaiming the everlasting gospel, and that the essence of that gospel is to tell men and women, worship the God who created the heaven and earth.
Yeah, I find that topic endlessly fascinating. But what about the name? That's something that I think is interesting in the day and age we live in today. Seventh-day Adventist, some people still get caught up in that name. They kind of think it's a long name or a strange name. But tell us about the name Seventh-day Adventist, because I think from your perspective, as someone who studies history and is well aware of our church's history, tell our listeners, how does the name Seventh-day Adventist support that mission of proclaiming the everlasting gospel to the whole world, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people?
Seventh-day Adventist is one of those interesting terms that actually may first have arisen or been used by hostile groups as a kind of insult. One can think similarly of the Lollards, who were heretics in medieval England in the 14th century, in some ways forerunners of the Reformation. One thinks of the Huguenots, who were Protestants in France, and indeed of the Puritans in England and then later America. All of their names were originally insults that were hurled at them by people who disliked them, and they later sort of embraced. And Seventh-day Adventist, the key here is the first part is actually Adventist. Adventist means one who believes that Christ will come again, that he will have a second coming, a second advent. Advent's not one of those words we use very much anymore, though in Europe it's still used for the whole month of December, the Christmas season or the Advent season, because of course it marks Christ's first advent. So that's what people would be familiar with in Europe, but so it's and the word has kind of dropped out of use. But in the 19th century, it was still very much in use, and so Christ's second advent. In 1844, there was a very large group of Protestants, almost entirely Protestants, in the northeast of the United States. A few people elsewhere, but mostly in the northeast of the United States, who believed that Christ would come in 1844. Now, obviously, they got the date wrong, but they put a new focus on Christ's second coming, which many Christians at the time, and many Christians today, Travis, don't believe that Christ will actually come again in the clouds to judge the quick and the dead, as the book of Revelation so graphically describes. They believe that that is a metaphor for the triumph of the church, for the triumph of Christian values, of Christian society. And It's meant very sincerely, but at times it ends up being a triumph of sort of just good works and social do-gooding. It loses that truly apocalyptic edge. So that group of Adventists in the 1840s, and they called themselves Adventists, though they got some things fundamentally wrong, were doing an important service. They were the group that reminded American Protestantism that the Bible really does say that Jesus Christ will come again. And so there was this group of Adventists, some of whom, a very tiny minority of whom, because they'd got the date wrong of 1844, obviously they're tremendously shaken by that, and so they start to think, well, we need to study the Bible more closely. There were other Adventists who just found the whole thing so traumatic they gave up belief and they wouldn't study the Bible at all, which is a tragedy. But the forerunners of Seventh-day Adventists said, no, we've got to go back and study the Bible more closely, find out where we went wrong. And as they did that, they recognized that the Bible teaches that the seventh day is the Sabbath, not the seventh day of the week, that is the Sabbath, not the first day, Sunday, though almost all churches were keeping Sunday. And they actually got this partly by conversation with a very small Protestant denomination, the Seventhday Baptists. And they studied it and said, the Ten Commandments is clear, the seventh day is the Sabbath. And it's there actually throughout the Old Testament, repeated time and time again. And it's never changed. And so they started to keep the seventh day as the Sabbath. And this made them an object of derision for many in mid-19th century America, who accused them of Judaizing, that is, of adopting Jewish religious practices, which, America was quite anti-Semitic then. So that was seen as a terrible thing. And so it's likely that the first people to come up with this term were people who disliked these seventh-day Sabbath-keeping Adventists and said, well, you people, you're just Seventh-day Adventists. But it actually really accurately describes the two absolutely fundamental pillars of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One, Christ is coming again, and that will end the world as we know it. It will be the end of what Adventists call a great controversy between Christ and Satan that began with Satan's rebellion in heaven, and we believe will end with his final annihilation and the annihilation of evil at the end of time, at the second advent. And the other part is the seventh-day Sabbath, that brings us back. Sorry to be so long in coming back to Revelation chapter 14, verses 6 and 7. But the command there is worship God. Worship him because he created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water, which is the language of Genesis chapter 1. Those are the things that are described as being created in the Genesis narrative. So in that proclamation, it's pointing people back to the centrality of the extraordinary truth that God was the creator, something that in the mid-19th century in America didn't seem so important. But today, when we're told from all sides that matter just came into existence, that centrality of God as the author and originator of all things is powerful and is in danger of being lost sight of. And of course, that is the foundation of everything else. Why do we worship God? Because he is the creator of all things. And Revelation 14 points us back to the creation, and the seventh day is the memorial of creation. In the Ten Commandments, it actually says, you should honor the seventh day to keep it holy, because on the seventh day, God rested from his creative work as described again in Genesis. So this is what binds these things together. And so Seventh-day Adventist, in a sense, doesn't reference Revelation, but actually it does. This is the everlasting gospel. God created everything. There is a purpose to existence. And though there is evil, which arises from men and women's free choice, free will, God will destroy that evil and put an end to it. And so there's if you like, a nice circle there, the true circle of life. God is the creator. He created us. He gave us free will. We mess things up pretty spectacularly. But God, through Jesus Christ, has a solution to that problem, and there will be an end, and there will be perfection thereafter.
Yeah, I think that is so fascinating how the name literally goes from beginning to end. It is a
It literally
full.
does. It is. It's the alpha and omega of names, you might say.
One of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Ellen White, for those listening, she had an interesting statement that I wanted to read regarding the name, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. She says, the name Seventh-day Adventist carries the true features of our faith in front and will convict the inquiring mind. Like an arrow from the Lord's quiver, it will wound the transgressors of God's law and will lead to repentance toward God and faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, that's an interesting statement. How would you unpack that a little bit for us? How can a name have convicting power?
I think, again, because of what it points to. And the name in itself actually probably doesn't have convicting power. It actually has a power to confuse. As a scholar myself and someone who deals with information research, it's very rare that a non-Adventist scholar spells the name correctly. It's supposed to be with a hyphen between the seventh and day and a lowercase d. Because it's an adjective. For those of you listeners who liked grammar, of course, the reason is that it's seventh day is a compound adjective, and so it gets hyphenated according to the laws of English. But almost invariably, you find non-Adventists spell it as two separate words with a capital D. Interestingly, just as a complete tangent, but the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints says the same thing. Latter day is hyphenated with a lowercase d. But this just seems to be too much for anyone who writes about Adventism to work out. It's very rare that you find a non-Adventist scholar gets it correct. So it does actually, at first glimpse, it's a name that just seems to confuse. But if somebody is interested, that is when it will be an arrow that can convict the inquiring mind. Because if you think about it, and if somebody were to sort of say, well, what's going on with that, rather than just say, Seventh-day Adventist, that's a long and confusing name. If somebody was to say, well, why? What is it pointing to? Then they will find that it points to the beginning of all things and the ending of all things. And Ellen White, who you mention and who that quotation is from, one of her most powerful books and best-selling books is called The Great Controversy. And it begins and ends with the statement, God is love. And that is the omega and the alpha, the beginning and the end of the story. And that is what Seventh-day Adventist points to. It points to the beginning. God is love and creates out of his creative instinct, and because he loves and wants creatures to share his love and to share love with others. And to the end, when God will put an end to the suffering that human beings have caused and continue to cause, and embrace those who love him and follow him, because God is love. That is what Seventh-day Adventist does. In a world today where the word Adventist is not so well understood, it probably doesn't convict the inquiring mind as much as it did when Ellen White wrote those words. But it is still the case that anyone who actually gives thought to what is being said will be pointed to the cardinal positions of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but also cardinal doctrines of the Christian Church.
Yeah, and I find that fascinating that you brought that up because, when you read the Gospels, there is an indication many times that Jesus shares information that from a kind of a shallow point of view, or just kind of looking at it quickly, might not convict or might not even be noticed. But for those who are really inquiring, there would be some deep truth there for the true seekers. And so I had never really thought about the name from quite the way you said it, but it makes sense to me that could be confusing to someone who is not necessarily a seeker, but for someone who is seeking truth, it has that deeper level to it.
No, I think it does. I think that's right.
A 2017 Christianity Today article entitled "The Rise of the Nuns: Protestants Keep Ditching Denominations" reported that just before the year 2000, 50% of Americans identified with a Protestant denomination, but now only 30% do. It went on to say, increasingly, Christian Americans prefer to either identify themselves simply as Christians or attend the increasing number of non-denominational churches that have no formal allegiance to a broader religious structure. As a historian, why do you think this is the case? What is causing this trend away from denominations and toward a non-denominational preference for Christians, at least in America? But maybe you have some perspective from beyond that.
Yeah, well, it's actually worse than that, because that 2017 Christianity Today article is based on findings of very comprehensive research done by the Pew Charitable Trust, one of the leading social science and opinion survey-based organizations in the world. And it's not just that Protestants are moving away from organized denominations and into non-denominational churches, but that people are abandoning religious practice or belief altogether. That's the more worrying. But the interesting thing is, and this is what complicates narratives that some people would say talk about a rise of secularism, because secularism is one of those terms that can be interpreted in different ways. Secularism, in many people's eyes, would actually mean a rise of valuing the secular, the irreligious, over anything else. It would imply perhaps even a privileging of agnosticism or atheism, and that's not what's happening. That's the interesting thing. People are abandoning belief in Christianity, but they're not becoming atheists in larger numbers. And I think actually, if you think about it, that's understandable. Who wants to believe that their life is utterly meaningless, and that we have no, and this is seriously what a number of the protagonists of atheism like Dawkins and others and Dennett and others would say, which is that we really have no conscious choice. It's all just a matter of electrons colliding with each other, and consciousness and free will are essentially they're just an appearance. So who wants to believe that I'm just a collection of matter that's drifting through the universe depending on how it collides with other electrons? That's not actually a very appealing thing to believe, even apart from the fact that it's got significant holes in it. So people aren't becoming atheists and agnostics in significantly large numbers. Instead, what you get is this classic answer that started to appear in the 90s and is now again and again in opinion surveys: I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Now, what does that mean? It's a good question, and it deserves further exploration. But what it seems to mean in practice is that people, they want to believe there's some kind of purpose to the universe. They want to believe there's some kind of God or gods or some deities, that there's some kind of afterlife. They believe all of these things, but they've stopped believing in formal religion. They've stopped believing in the revealed truths of Christianity, of Jesus Christ, his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, his second coming. They've certainly stopped believing in churches. And so that rise of the nuns is actually even more concerning for us who are religious, for Seventh-day Adventists, than it sounds, because it's not just that Protestants are saying, well, I'm now non-denominational. It's people in opinion surveys increasingly are saying, I'm none of the above. I don't choose this or that religious group, but they still have this spiritual urge. And I think, Travis, that's because we were created by God, and deep within us is a yearning, a longing for the spiritual. There's a saying that we have a God-shaped hole in our lives, and I think that's true. As for the reasons why, I can speak there better to Europe than to America. And to be fair, in America currently the trend is more of Protestants just becoming non-denominational. But the numbers who are saying they're not religious of any organized religion is rising, and that's the direction Europe went in, and America is going down the same road. And I may say the rest of the developed world is going down it too. We may have believers in Mexico and Brazil and who are saying, no, it'll never come here. It's coming. That's the reality of a globalized society in which we all watch the same things, listen to the same things. In Europe, it's partly a matter of prosperity. Wealth and materialism is probably the greatest solvent of Christian practice, but not necessarily of Christian faith. And I think in Europe, part of the issue is a history of that religion has led to war, which it did, to be fair, in the 16th and 17th centuries, that religion is oppressive, that religion is repressive, that it has no place for those who don't fit into certain narrow niches, and so that religion is oppressive of LGBTQI, it's oppressive of women, and that it's also got no place in the real world. It's about debating over abstruse matters rather than engaging what's really important. And all of that partly comes out of Europe's actual history. There were religious wars. The church, especially the Roman Catholic Church, in the past was very repressive, and actually loose state churches, Protestant state churches in Europe were repressive and oppressive as well, though to a lesser extent. Of course, none of that's the case today, but it does partly come out of that history. But those perceptions, those attitudes that Christianity is not engaged with what's really important, that it's oppressive of people of diverse sexualities and genders and of women. And in America, I think there's an extra factor, which is that Christianity here is perceived as being hostile to immigrants and to the poor, which I think is a fair point. Some of the largest Protestant denominations in America preach a prosperity gospel, Travis. They preach, if you're faithful, you'll have a rich, you'll literally be rich, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a financial sense, which I have to say I don't see in the gospel at all. But that kind of prosperity gospel does, I think, stoke the perception, the fears that Christianity is really hostile to those who are living on the margins, which is ironic, Travis, if you think about the Gospels, because where is Jesus Christ? He's with the people on the margins.
Yeah.
So I think those are the things that I see fueling this trend.
Yeah, and I also wanted to get your opinion kind of on, what is the appeal of like a neutral Christianity, a Christianity that doesn't have, quote unquote, a brand behind it.
It's the organization. You see this in other areas of life. This is one of the manifestations of postmodernity. There's a suspicion of organization, and there's a distrust of organizations in general. There's a distrust of the government. There's a distrust even of organizations that once were very reputable. If you look at opinion polls, they'll show that trust in the government is much less than 40 years ago. Trust in, say, particular branches, the House of Representatives, the Senate in this country. That trust in the media, trust in newspapers is much lower. Trust in doctors and lawyers. People have just become extremely distrusting. And that's true of religious organizations. And so churches have got an ecclesiastical structure, and people are saying, no, I don't want that. I'll go to this non-denominational church, which is just a group of us getting together on a Sunday, because it usually is a Sunday, and singing happy songs and feeling good together. And so it's got all the pluses, but none of the minuses that they perceive. Of course, the problem is what happens, if you disagree about something, what happens if you have a theological dispute? Well, who owns the property? There were reasons the churches got organized in the past, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In the 1850s, the pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, were utterly opposed to any kind of organization. And then they encountered all these practical issues and difficulties, and they said, right, in order for us to proclaim the everlasting gospel and to get people to worship God, we're going to have some kind of organizational structure. So I think that's what it is. People are distrusting, and again, it comes back to power. Churches, organized churches, denominations, are perceived as power structures, and to some extent, of course, that's right. But also in America, much less so than Europe today, churches do get involved in politics. They do take stances on social and moral issues. And so it's easy for people to slip into that view of saying, whoa, this church really is caught up in politics. I think it's one of the blessings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is that we reject any kind of alignment between church and state. And so we don't make those same kind of pronouncements. We don't get involved in the same way. Adventists do address social ills and problems, but we tend not to do it through a party political process. But in America, there's a lot of Protestant churches that do. And so people see that, and they say, this is just about power, and it's about hostility to people on the margins, and I don't want to be part of that.
I'm not saying that people who are attracted to non-denominational churches are against mission, but isn't the purpose of organization mission, and isn't that the kind of glue that holds a church organization together?
Well, it should be. But I can tell you as an historian, the truth is that whenever you create some kind of organizational structure, people will get caught up in defending it, in maintaining it, in upbuilding it, in trying to control it. And so there's always the danger that an organized church will become an ends rather than a means. That's just human nature. And that's what various people pointed out in the 1850s, and one reason Seventh-day Adventists were wary of organizing. But the truth is the benefits the positives outweigh the negatives.
So is the name Seventh-day Adventist still relevant today, based on...
Yes, absolutely, because there is still the need for people to worship God who created the heavens, the earth, and everything. God is the creator, so he is worthy of being acknowledged and praised and worshipped. But also God is love. The way the world is not the way God intended it. And the solution to it is not abandoning God. It's a return to God, a return to attempting to live by his laws and walk in his ways, even though we know as sinful human beings that's not going to happen all the time, but to try to live as Christ would have us live as we look forward to that time when sin will be done away with and perfection will reign. And if you look at today's world, the message of Seventh Day, which points to creation, is ever more relevant than it has been at any time in human history. Because even 100 years ago, the idea that you could destroy the earth would have seemed far-fetched to most people. And yet Revelation talks about punishment to those who destroy the earth. Well, that's what we're doing, Travis. Human beings are raping God's creation, destroying it willy-nilly. So that message is always relevant. Perhaps it's because human beings always do have that God-shaped hole in their heart, in their soul, and they have a spiritual longing. But today especially, as we poison the very air we breathe and the water we drink, apparently with no concern for the future, the reminder that this is what God created. This has a sacred origin and should be honored, and eventually will be made perfect, but only after, unfortunately, this world is done away with. That message is especially relevant right now, I think.
And so for our listeners, to make this conversation a little bit more practical, how does being a member of an organized church, or specifically a local church that is representative of a worldwide church, how does that help people or become an important part of being ready for Jesus? Is that connection important? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. If you look at the New Testament, which describes what we call the early church, which is it's the people who followed Jesus and the people who they told about the good news of Jesus and who found it compelling as well, and so it spread. It was all about community. If you read the New Testament, I think it's often this point is missed, but if you read the letters of the Apostle Paul, for example, it's all about dealing with the practical problems of living as a community of Christian believers when surrounded by a wider community of in his case, pagans, but of the irreligious today. So Christianity is by its nature a religion of community. It's very hard to practice in isolation. We're meant to practice it together with other believers with whom we join in worshiping God. So the role of the organized church is absolutely central in that it creates that community of believers which strengthens us even as we strengthen those around us in their spiritual walk, their walk with God, their trials and difficulties, and it enables us more effectively to share that good news of Jesus Christ with those around us.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that a little bit, so for you personally, how has being a member of a worldwide church organization like the Seventh-day Adventist Church been beneficial to you outside of your career, but just in your spiritual walk? How have you benefited from being a part of this organization?
It points one constantly to the fact that there are things greater than oneself. And in certain parts of the world, being a Seventh-day Adventist Christian is very easy. One can go to a large church my local church has a membership of, I think, in excess of 2,000. It's got a pastoral staff of 6. It would be very easy to be comfortable and just think, okay, I've got a team of professionals to do everything for me. So being part of a worldwide church is a reminder that there are many different experiences. There are parts of the world where it's one pastor for 6 churches, or indeed for 16, instead of 6 pastors for one church. And Christians, I think one of the essences of Christianity is that we're constantly being called to look beyond ourselves. You could say that in some ways what underlies the original sin of eating the forbidden fruit is being focused on selfishness. Mm-hmm. And so Christianity, in essence of it, is drawing us out of ourselves. So if you're just a member of a local non-denominational church, well, that might be meeting your needs. But there's many believers out there, and there's many people who have never heard of Jesus Christ. And the only way to help those who are like us but don't have this privileged situation is by an organizational structure that can take resources from where it's strong and apply them to where the church is weak, and that can take those resources and apply it to the place where the church barely exists at all, so that people can know the good news of Jesus Christ. So being a member of a worldwide church is important to me because it constantly points me to the fact that there's something beyond myself. I'm part of a wider whole that's important to me, but also I need to contribute, not just to being comfortable myself, but to a worldwide message that really should go to every nation and people group and language and so forth.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Adventology. Our goal on this podcast is for you to be ready for Jesus. And the best way to be ready for Jesus is to spend time getting to know him. Knowing Jesus is everything. And if you want to get to know him better, then I encourage you to check out our website, adventology.com, where you can find links and transcripts to all of our previous episodes. Also, if you haven't rated us on iTunes or any other platform you might be listening to us from, please do it now. It really makes a difference. Also, contact us and let us know how you like the new interview format that we just introduced today. All right, well, I enjoyed our time together, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Adventology. Until then, Maranatha.